We look at the modern Cocker Spaniel and see a polished, gentle companion. But the DNA reveals a hidden past that completely contradicts this image. If you look past the modern show-ring pedigree, the genetic record shows a lineage far more rugged and capable than we ever realized. Today, we are breaking down the science of the Cocker Spaniel's true ancestry to see what the breed's DNA is hiding beneath that soft exterior. If you love uncovering the hidden truth behind your favorite breeds, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Let's dive into the science. In 1667, Nicholas Cox wrote about the small land spaniels as brave, strong, and nimble dogs, with active tails and attentive noses. That image matters because it does not sound like the portrait of a fragile ornament carefully placed on a cushion. It sounds like a creature built to move, to listen, to follow a task without hesitation. By 1879, the story had changed shape. A single dog named Obo began to stand at the center of it, and with that one name, the scattered memory of working spaniels started to harden into a modern pedigree. In the record later summarized by Wikipedia, Obo was recognized as the father of the modern English Cocker Spaniel. That detail matters because it marks a turn from vague ancestry to official identity. What had once lived in barns, fields, and regional habits was being drawn into a narrower frame, one animal at a time. This is where the picture becomes more complicated. A lineage that had grown through usefulness was now being read through selection. Obo was not simply a famous dog. He became a reference point, a living anchor for a standard that people could name, repeat, and protect. From that moment, the Cocker Spaniel was no longer only remembered as part of a broad working family. It was being separated, organized, and given a public face. The shift seems neat on paper, but genetics rarely honors neatness. DNA keeps what human labels try to simplify, and that is the tension building beneath the surface. The old descriptions pointed to a nimble hunter with a body made for purpose, while the 1879 pedigree moment tried to fix the image into something more deliberate and more uniform. Yet the very need for a father figure like Obo suggests uncertainty. If the breed were truly simple, why would one dog have to carry so much authority? Why would a tradition that had already existed in practice suddenly need a formal beginning? The answer lies in how breeding systems work. Once people start defining a type, they also start narrowing the range of traits they allow to survive. One kennel decision can lift a trait into prominence while pushing another into the background. A field dog becomes a recognizable kind. A recognizable kind becomes a pedigree, and a pedigree begins to tell a story that feels older and cleaner than it really is. Obo therefore represents more than an individual. He sits at the meeting point between inherited diversity and human preference. Before him, spaniel-like dogs in Britain were shaped by local need, by hunting ground, by practical handling, and by the long pressure of survival. After him, the same animal could be presented as a distinct line with a legible origin. That is a powerful transformation, but it is also a reduction. The deeper ancestry does not disappear. It simply becomes harder to see. There is another reason this matters. When a dog becomes a standard, the public often starts to confuse standard with origin. People look at the polished result and assume that this is where the story began. In reality, the polished result is often where the story was edited. The breed became easier to describe in the late 19th century, but easier to describe is not the same as easier to explain. Obo helped make the Cocker Spaniel English, modern, and identifiable. He did not erase what came before. That is why the genetic evidence feels so disruptive. The DNA does not just confirm the old working background, it exposes how much of that background survived beneath the label. The show-ring image suggests a tidy lineage, yet the genome carries older mixtures, older pressures, and older function. It remembers migration between regions, variation across tasks, and the slow layering of traits that human eyes later grouped together under one name. The pedigree created clarity. The genes preserve complexity. So the first official version of the Cocker Spaniel identity was not the final version. It was a frame, useful and influential, but still only a frame. Obo gave the modern English line a recognizable center, and in doing so he made the breed easier to admire, to register, and to repeat. But he also left a question hanging over everything that came after. If one dog could define the public face, what older history was still hiding behind that face? That is the quiet unease at the heart of the breed's ancestry. The more carefully the human record tries to fix it, the more strongly the DNA suggests movement underneath. The story is beginning to split into two timelines, the one people wrote down and the one the body never forgot. By 1892, the Kennel Club in the United Kingdom had done something that would change the way the Cocker Spaniel was seen forever. It recognized the English Cocker Spaniel as a separate breed. That sounds clean on paper, almost neat enough to settle the matter, but in reality it marked a fault line. A living population that had once moved through fields, kennels, and local habits was now being pulled into a defined shape, one that humans could record, compare, and defend. The date matters because it shows how late the label arrived compared with the older body beneath it. Long before the paperwork, there were working dogs being sorted by use, size, and region rather than by the formal language of breed. Yet 1892 gave the English line a legal edge. It became easier to say what belonged, what did not, and where the boundary should run. That shift did not create the dog itself, but it changed its public identity in a way that genetics would later complicate. And the split did not stay in Britain. In 1946, the American Kennel Club recognized the English Cocker Spaniel as a separate breed in the United States. That second decision seems distant, but it is crucial because it shows the same pattern repeating across the Atlantic. First a population with fluid ancestry, then a formal name, then a registry that freezes one version of the animal as the representative one. The UK and the US were not just documenting a dog. They were choosing which inheritance would be visible. That choice had consequences. Once the breed entered official records, every later image of refinement, charm, and domestic ease began to stand on top of a much rougher foundation. The Cocker Spaniel was not being invented from nothing in 1892 or 1946. It was being separated, sorted, and described after the fact. The paperwork made the dog legible to institutions, but it also hid the older continuity shared with other spaniels, other hunting dogs, and older working lines that had not cared about national borders. This is where the DNA starts to matter in a sharper way. The genome does not treat 1892 as a sacred beginning or 1946 as a final answer. It keeps older signals alive, traces of movement between places, selection for function before fashion, and a depth of variation that no registry could fully compress. The official separations give us milestones, but they also reveal how artificial milestones can be when measured against inheritance carried in cells. So the breed's history now looks split in two directions at once. On one side, there is the clean line of recognition, the Kennel Club in 1892, the American Kennel Club in 1946, the steady march of standardization. On the other side, there is a broader and older current that never stopped flowing, even when the name became fixed. That older current is what gives the Cocker Spaniel its unease and its depth. The dog we admire in the show ring was already carrying a longer memory than the registry could hold. If you are still following that hidden thread, stay with it. The next layer is where the neat boundaries begin to blur completely, and the breed's supposed simplicity starts to fall apart under the weight of its own ancestry. The coat was never just decoration. In a Cocker Spaniel, the long feathering around the ears, chest, and legs has always looked like a signature of breeding, something softened by human taste, until it became part of the breed's public face. But in 2009, a landmark study led by Cadieux et al., Science 2009, identified a mutation in the FGF5 gene as the reason that Cocker Spaniels grow long hair. That single finding changed the meaning of a familiar image. What had seemed like a quiet triumph of grooming and preference suddenly had a molecular cause buried inside it. This mattered because FGF5 is not a poetic detail. It is a biological switch tied to hair growth, and in the Cocker Spaniel it helps explain why the coat keeps extending instead of stopping early. The visible elegance was not only shaped in breeding yards and show rings, it was also written into the genome. That does not erase human selection. It makes selection look far more precise and far more intimate than anyone imagined. The breeders were not inventing the coat from nothing. They were working with a hidden instruction already present in the animal. I'm curious, did you realize your dog's appearance could be traced back to such specific molecular switches? Let me know in the comments below. And once that became clear, the breed's surface stopped feeling simple. The silky frame that made the Cocker Spaniel famous was no longer just a cosmetic result. It was evidence that physical identity can be locked into a single gene, then amplified by generations of preference until it looks like destiny. The dog's appearance had been read for years as proof of refinement, yet the DNA reveals something stranger. Refinement often begins with inheritance, not invention. That insight also opens a second question. If one of the breed's most recognizable features comes from a defined genetic change, how many other traits were given the same treatment by history before anyone knew how to name them? The cheerful face, the easy sociability, the working instinct that still flickers under the domestic polish. None of those appear in isolation. They sit on top of older layers, just as the coat sits on top of a deeper code. The genetics do not flatten the Cocker Spaniel into a laboratory object. They make it more human in the emotional sense, because they show how much care, repetition, and survival are stitched into one living body. So the long hair becomes a clue rather than a finish line. It tells us that what looked like pure style was actually an inherited mechanism, preserved and intensified over time. It tells us that the breed's identity is not held together by appearance alone, but by a chain of biological decisions older than any modern standard. And it leaves the larger mystery intact. If the coat could hide a molecular history this specific, what other parts of the Cocker Spaniel's character are carrying a past that has only just started to speak? If this hidden inheritance is starting to change the way you see the breed, stay with it. The next layer is even more revealing, because once the visible trait is traced back to DNA, the rest of the animal begins to look less like ornament and more like evidence. In 2010, a study published through Nature and indexed on PubMed forced a quiet correction into the story of the Cocker Spaniel. The surprise was not that the breed had history. It was that its genetic position sat closer to ancient working dogs than anyone had expected. Beneath the polished image, beneath the refined posture, people learned to associate with companionship. The DNA pointed toward a far older function. That mattered because it changed the question itself. For years, the breed had often been framed as a product of deliberate modern breeding, a dog shaped mainly for appearance, temperament, and the domestic life that followed. But the genetic evidence suggested something less neat and far more revealing. The Cocker Spaniel was not simply assembled from recent taste. It was carrying distance, memory, and inheritance from dogs that had earned their place through labor, not ornament. The study did not erase the later human hands that refined the breed. It made those hands visible in a new light. Selection for a shorter, more manageable body, for a sociable presence, for the kind of responsiveness families welcomed indoors, did not begin from a blank slate. It was layered over an older canine architecture, one already adapted to movement, tracking, and useful work. The beauty of the result came from history, not from abrupt invention, and that is the part that unsettles the simple version of the breed's origin. A dog that seems so tied to comfort can still be anchored in a lineage built for purpose. A companion can still carry the signature of a worker. In the Cocker Spaniel, the genetic map did not support the idea of a fragile modern creation. It revealed continuity, the kind that survives when a species is changed again and again without ever being completely rewritten. The more carefully you look at that finding, the more it resembles an inheritance hiding in plain sight. A breed can be admired for grace and still preserve the instincts of older lives. It can move through salons, homes, and show rings while keeping a deeper relation to dogs that once followed scent, flushed game, and stayed alert to the demands of terrain and task. That older closeness does not make the Cocker Spaniel less beloved. It makes the affection surrounding it feel more deserved, because the bond is not built on surface alone. If you want to understand why this matters, stay with the tension for a moment. The revelation is not simply that the breed is older than it appeared. It is that its identity was never sealed inside the modern label at all. The DNA points to a living bridge between companionship and utility, between what humans wanted to see and what the animal carried forward regardless. And once that bridge appears, the Cocker Spaniel stops looking like a story of decoration and starts looking like evidence of survival. That is the deeper shock. The breed's ancestry does not behave like a tidy line drawn for show. It behaves like layered memory, where function lingers even after function seems to have faded. What seemed to be a gentle domestic presence now reads as a descendant of practical, adaptable dogs whose influence was never fully lost. And with that, the Cocker Spaniel becomes something more complex than a refined companion. a witness to how history can remain alive inside the body long after the original work has changed. By 2017, the story had already started to crack in a place most readers never expect: the broader science of dog history itself. A critical review by Ostrander et al., Nature Reviews Genetics 2017, made a blunt point that changed the frame around breeds like the Cocker Spaniel. The demography of dogs, the authors said, and the functional diversity written into their genome are more complex than people had imagined. That mattered because it meant the old habit of reading a breed as a clean, recent invention was never quite safe. Think about what that does to the popular image. If the Cocker Spaniel seems neatly packaged now, with its soft reputation and familiar outline, that neatness may be an illusion imposed much later than the animal's deeper past. The 2017 review did not just add another layer of detail, it exposed a weakness in the whole model of simple descent. It suggested that canine history was never a straight corridor. It was a moving landscape, shaped by population shifts, practical selection, regional mixing, and traits that survived because they still mattered. That is the contradiction hidden inside the breed's polished public identity. The more humans tried to sort dogs into tidy modern categories, the more the biology underneath refused to stay tidy. A Cocker Spaniel can look like a settled companion in the present, and still carry the marks of older exchanges that cannot be reduced to one line, one kennel, or one fashionable era. The genome does not behave as a decorative label. It behaves like a record of movement, and that is why the 2017 finding changes the emotional center of the story. It is no longer enough to say that the breed simply became what breeders wanted. The deeper truth is less obedient. Even the wider canine genome was showing signs of a history too tangled for easy narration, which means the Cocker Spaniel's ancestry sits inside a much larger pattern of inherited complexity. In other words, the breed was not hiding a small surprise. It was participating in a larger correction. Once that becomes clear, the old narrative loses its authority. The dog once presented as a refined product of human taste now belongs to a lineage whose background was already layered before modern labels tried to flatten it. The significance is not just historical, it is personal. Every familiar trait starts to feel less like ornament and more like surviving memory, preserved through generations that passed through changing work, changing homes, and changing expectations. If you are following the thread, stay with it a little longer. The surprise is not that science found complexity where people expected simplicity. The surprise is how late that complexity was allowed to matter. For years, the surface story was easier to tell: a recognizable breed, a controlled standard, a clear pedigree. But the revision in 2017 insists on a different reading. Canine ancestry, including the Cocker Spaniels, is not a narrow corridor of purity. It is an accumulated history of adaptation, and that makes the familiar face in front of us feel older, wider, and far less domesticated than the popular story ever admitted. And perhaps that is the quiet power of the evidence. It does not strip away affection, it deepens it. A dog that carries a more complicated history is not less intimate to know. It is more real. The Cocker Spaniel stops being only a symbol of refinement and becomes something harder to dismiss. Proof that living bodies remember far more than public labels can hold. Call it a breed, call it a companion, call it a classic of domestic life if you want. The genome, as Ostrander et al. Reminded us in 2017, tells a fuller story, one in which simplicity was always the last thing the dog could afford. Then the picture widened again. In 2023, the Dog 10K Consortium pushed past the small window of isolated breed studies and sequenced the genomes of 2,000 dogs, a scale large enough to change what could be seen at all. Published in Genome Biology, the Dog 10K Consortium, Wang et al. In 2019, did more than add another line to canine history. It strengthened the map of dog demography and gene function, showing how ancestry leaves signals not only in a single breed's traits, but across populations, lineages, and time. And once that lens widened, the Cocker Spaniel looked even less like a simple product of neat breeding and more like a living archive shaped by older movement, working need, and long memory. That matters because scale changes meaning. A small genetic study can point toward a clue. A consortium built around thousands of genomes can show whether the clue holds up when the background noise grows louder. The Dog 10K project gave researchers a broader frame for reading variation, and with that frame, the Cocker Spaniel's profile stopped looking isolated. Its coat, its temperament, its ease with people, even the way the breed carries itself with that familiar softness, began to feel like the visible edge of something deeper, an inheritance that had survived because it was useful before it was admired. This is where the story turns from correction into confirmation. Earlier portraits had already hinted that the breed's roots were older and more functional than the polished image suggested, but a large genomic effort like this makes such a reading harder to dismiss. When 2,000 dogs are sequenced, the question is no longer whether one breed appears unusual by accident. The question becomes what patterns keep reappearing when the sampling is broad enough to catch them. For the Cocker Spaniel, the answer points back to continuity. Not a clean break from working dogs, but a thread that ran through them. And that thread also explains why the breed's identity has always felt a little larger than its reputation. The public face is easy to remember. The silky ears, the compact frame, the affectionate gaze that made the Cocker Spaniel a favorite companion. Yet genomic evidence at this scale suggests that those features sit on top of older biology, not apart from it. The dog we know today is refined, yes, but refinement is not the same as invention. The dog carries the afterimage of a past in which field, gun, human hand, and selective pairing all pulled in the same direction. The Dog 10K consortium did not erase that past. It made it harder to simplify. By bringing 2,000 genomes into view, genome biology helped confirm that canine history is better read as a layered population story than as a gallery of fixed forms. That is why the Cocker Spaniel's ancestry now feels more credible, not less, when it is described as deep and mixed. The breed's charm remains intact, but the explanation for that charm becomes far richer. A long chain of choices, drifts, pressures, and inheritances preserved in a body that still looks gentle enough to hide the labor behind it. Listen closely to that shift, because it changes the emotional center of the story. The surprise is no longer only that science found complexity where legend preferred simplicity. The deeper surprise is that modern sequencing gave that complexity enough weight to stand up in the open. A dog once read through appearance alone can now be placed inside a broader evolutionary conversation, one that includes older working roles and the slow shaping force of human selection without reducing the animal to either. The Cocker Spaniel becomes less a decorative endpoint and more a witness to continuity. And maybe that is why the result lands so strongly. A breed does not become less lovable when its history grows larger. It becomes harder to flatten. The Cocker Spaniel, viewed through the 2023 Dog 10K data, is a reminder that identity can be both familiar and ancient at once, both intimate and shared across generations we never saw. If this kind of discovery changes anything, it is the way we look back at living companions, not as finished products, but as survivors of a far longer story still visible in the structure of their bodies. So the final image is not of a dog invented by fashion, nor of a pedigree sealed in a single moment. It is of something more enduring, a line continued, tested, reshaped, and still here. And in that continuity, the Cocker Spaniel gives us a quiet lesson worth holding on to. Sometimes the truest version of a creature is the one that becomes visible only when we learn to see it at the scale of history. If this deep dive changed the way you see your dog, please like this video and share it with another breed lover.